Thank you.
All right, we're recording.
Good morning, everybody, to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Again, we are pleased that people are with us from Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, all three. And so we welcome all three groups. Our text for today is from 1 Peter. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. This is 1 Peter chapter 1. His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Thus he has given us through these things his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may escape from the corruption that is in the world because of lust, and may become participants in the divine nature. For this very reason, you must make every effort to support your faith with goodness, and goodness with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with endurance, and endurance with godliness, and godliness with mutual affection, and mutual affection with love. For if these things are yours and are increasingly among you, they keep you from being ineffective and unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So we pray. Dear God, again, thank you for this Sabbath school class. Thank you for this technology. Thank you for people all over the world who are meeting in similar sessions on the internet and in person. The Sabbath is a great joy for all of us, and we are grateful for it. We are also grateful for Dr. Chartier, who's going to lead us in another fruitful discussion, and we will benefit from his study and experience. We think also of those of our members and others who are not well. We pray for them and hope that they will find the strength and courage and wisdom that they need right now. And if there's anything we can do to be of help, that we will discern it. In Christ's name, amen. Welcome, Gary, back to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. And welcome back to Bob Ford, too, because, oh, and there's Margie. Welcome back from, I think, Inter-America, Bob.
Yes, I was helping three church groups, one from the Indiana Conference, Michigan Conference, Colorado, and some from Loma Linda, actually, some medical students on a mission project building the boarding school in El Salvador is being turned into the Second Adventist College in Central America.
Oh, wow.
Wow, wonderful.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. Sometime I can share with you what's going on there. It's great. Yeah.
Well, we'll schedule you. Start getting your presentation ready, because we're going to be we're going to be on your doorstep asking for some help. Okay, over to Gary, and we are looking now at chapter 8 of his book, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. And this is the very last chapter, and it's a, I think, important chapter for those of us who are Adventists, but also for the world of ethics in general. The chapter is entitled Creational Love, Sin, and Virtue. Now, maybe I can just set this up a little bit along these lines. We have been thinking about decision-making theory all the while, and Gary has given us this helpful norm as love as appropriate regard for the well-being of the other. That appropriate regard is really, really important. And we've been exploring the various ramifications of that, I think, fruitfully. But, and that has been the way much of ethics has gone for the last several decades, and medical ethics in particular has gone that way. That is, the task has been to find out what one can do in difficult circumstances when nobody else has quite thought the matter through. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about the actions that people should make. But there has been some pushback against that in the last couple of decades, 3 decades, I think. I am aware of it beginning with Stanley Hauerwas, but it may have started earlier than that. And his point, and the point of people like him, is that we're making a mistake by concentrating on decision-making theories that talk about actions, and we should talk about actors instead. We should be concerned not with what people choose to do, but what kind of people they will be. And this is called virtue ethics. Fair enough. And they are able to point back to Aquinas, and from Aquinas back to Plato and Aristotle, who did not develop ethics along the lines that we have, but they did talk about virtues and the virtues of a cultivated person, which were related to the virtues of a society. So virtue ethics has a long and distinguished history, and for sure we should be attentive to that. My problem, though, and this is where I want Gary to jump in, see what he thinks. My problem, though, is the juxtaposition of virtue ethics versus action ethics, as though one or the other is sufficient. And I think it's the case that people in medical ethics, particularly, who are interested in virtue ethics, are sometimes quite disparaging of the kinds of ethics that we've been doing. That is, ethics that deals with actions. They want us to deal with actors. But it seems to me that the assumption is that a good person, a virtuous person, will make right decisions. And I'm not persuaded of that at all. I think a righteous person could make a wrong decision. Decisions could be right or wrong. People can be good or bad. And I don't think it's enough for us to cultivate virtues. I think we need to think about decision-making theory too. And I don't think it's enough to do decision-making theory. We ought to talk about virtues as well. So that's my little way of getting at this. Gary, what would you like to say?
Well, thanks, Dave. So in the there are some other, of course, bits of the book that really do focus very much on specific issues, whether the issues raised in the Decalogue or in Chapter 7, issues raised in the various moral teachings of the New Testament. And I think what I try to do there should make clear, in tandem, especially with what happens in the first couple of chapters of the book, that I think choices matter a great deal. I don't believe we can simply have an ethic that dispenses with offering insights useful to judgment, right? I think the approach, in other words, we have every reason, it seems to me, to be interested in the kinds of people we are and in the kinds of people our loved ones and other people are. The question of virtue is an important one, but I don't think in any way it somehow is a substitute for critical reflection on choice and critical reflection on the principles that we draw on when we make choices. This is one of those ways in which I am I suppose, labels aren't helpful here, but the bottom line is I think principles matter. And really what I've tried to offer here finally in Loving Creation is an ethic of principles. But I also think it's important to recognize that the Christian moral tradition has taken questions of character very seriously. And that's why I try to reflect on the classic Christian virtues and cardinal sins in this last chapter.
Yes, and I think that it's very helpful that your book includes both, that it doesn't take sides on this, I think, misplaced debate. And surely we need, now we can name people right off the bat, both in medical ethics and in ethics more generally, who have who have been unhappy with decision-making theory and how it focuses particularly on quandary cases. Their point is the decision-making action principles, ethics is always coming up with these unusual, bizarre cases that most of us will never face. And that instead of looking at those bizarre issues, we should be cultivating our own inner lives. Okay, now that's one whole set of issues. But there's another set of issues here, and I'm glad to see that Anastasia is with us. I'm not quite sure where she is, maybe in Philadelphia. But from the Greek tradition, there may have Greek Christian tradition.
I'm here.
Okay. Oh, there you are in Loma Linda. Okay, good. All right. You will be going to Greece shortly. This whole idea of participating in the divine nature. Now, that is something I think that the Greek tradition has made more of than the Latin tradition. And I think the notion of participating in the divine nature has almost become a bad word, a bad expression in Latin Christianity. And if there's a time, I'd like to explore that with you first, not first, but as well.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know how much I have to say that's insightful there, but of course, I think it's great to talk about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does suggest that that the nature of God and our own nature is not so different that there can be no participation of one in the other. So righteousness is not totally alien. It's not from above and beyond. Okay, well, let's get back to virtue. What is a virtue and what is a vice?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there are different ways of thinking about this, but I'm in this chapter trying to understand virtues and vices, virtues and, cardinal virtues and cardinal sins, understood as dispositions or habits or patterns of response. So quality, you might think about qualities of character.
Mm-hmm. That word habits comes up a lot. And then you mentioned dispositions and then intentions, motivations, affections.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All of those count there. Now, in the West, we have had, 7 basic virtues?
Right.
So Greeks and 4 from the Greeks and 3 from us.
Yeah, I think that's been the pattern. We've taken prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, which were the cardinal virtues in the ancient Mediterranean world, and not abandoning those, but combining them then with faith, hope, and love, drawn, of course, especially from 1 Corinthians 13.
I think that's a very interesting thing, both for the substance of the matter, but also because it's a good illustration of how Christianity might relate to non-Christian resources.
Yes.
That is, instead of blowing up, destroying, and discarding all the excellent things that are in other cultures, we accept them and then build on them. We go beyond. Okay, now I'm going to look at your chapter and notice that you talk about sin. How about talking about sin? Tell us about sin.
Yeah. So again, I think we can. There are a couple of different ways we might, we might think about this. This is a bit more complicated. That is, it has been common, at least I think, in Christian circles, to talk about sin perhaps at three levels, to talk about sin as bad choice, to talk
Mhm.
about sin as bad character trait, and then to
Mhm.
talk about sin as existential orientation, right?
Oh, I like that. I like that.
Uh, and so I'm not I'm sure doing justice to any of those in this fairly brisk treatment in the chapter, but the idea that we can see how an ethic of love might be relevant at each of those levels is at least worth talking about briefly, right? So whether we're talking about dispositions again or habits that might tilt us away from choosing in a way that's consistent with love, whether we're talking about individual choices that are themselves inconsistent with love, or whether we're talking about a kind of overall kind of orientation of the self that might be in one way or another inconsistent with love. We can get at sin at any of those levels, I think. And obviously, there are, encyclopedias to be written about what one might say at each point there. So I'm just noting this in general, and you and I can move forward there in whatever way makes sense to you.
Let me make sure I've got it. Sin as a wrong choice, sin as a bad habit, and sin as an existential orientation, the direction of the person. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I want to pause here a little bit and hover around the one about the orientation of the person. And I think at that point, we might bump up against the distinction between actual sin and, most importantly, original sin. I see Simona has her hand up. Let's get, if you can talk about original sin a little bit, because I think that notion has had much value, but I also think the notion of original sin has been very destructive.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, Dave. It seems to me so. The idea of original sin understood as sin that is a kind of inherent feature of the human condition, not because of the way we're created, but because of well, so often I think, and certainly in the Western tradition, we'd say, because of the first sin of the first, human person. Um, Again, I think you rightly note is something that we can see as both positive and negative. It's so this way of talking is positive insofar as it highlights the fact that we arrive in the world with dispositions and circumstances in virtue of which we don't begin perhaps on a kind of level playing field morally, but there are I mean, it's complicated because we certainly are, in virtue of inherited dispositions and social circumstances, disposed in some ways to behave well, but we also arrive with dispositions to behave badly that precede our freedom. And that's absolutely a part of our experience, and it would be naive to ignore that aspect of our constitutions, let's say. So I think that's what's positive about this, that there's a recognition of the complex moral reality of who we are. The downside, of course, I think for those of us who value freedom and responsibility is that the idea of original sin has often been associated with the idea of guilt that pre-exists freedom. And so that there's somehow a kind of liability to condemnation that arises just in virtue of our coming into the world. And, this has had, I think, profoundly destructive consequences, underwriting, say, predestinarian views and attitudes that are often quite punitive toward, people in social institutions and so forth. So I think, while it matters to note that we don't arrive in the world morally perfect, it also matters to recognize that the idea that we arrive in the world guilty is an idea that I think just reflects confusion about what guilt could mean. And again, I'm not in favor of punitive views anyway with respect to responsibility that we actually ourselves assume. But I think it's important to recognize that the idea that there's guilt that we don't assume, that just sort of inheres in our creaturely existence, is an invitation to injustice and exclusion on the part of persons and institutional actors.
Yeah, just to keep pushing your point, I think
Yeah.
the idea of original sin has been helpful in politics to remind institutions that they are flawed and
Yes.
prone to be self-regarding, excessively self-regarding. But it always alarms and offends me to think of a newborn child as a guilty sinner.
Yeah.
And that is not an exception. That is, I think, for many people, the rule, that this little child that has just come to the world is, by virtue of being born into this situation, guilty.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's horrific.
I agree completely. I mean, I remember a well-known pastor, actually an Adventist pastor, saying somewhere, this was in a written text, I remember, somehow trying to offer as an example that, well, there's a baby on the front row, and if the baby's disturbed, the baby will start crying, and that's a sign that the baby is sinful. And
Yes, that's the kind
that's
of thing.
ridiculous.
That
Yeah.
is absolutely,
Mhm.
and that has led to very severe and harsh treatment of people. If
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
baby is sinning when crying, I guess you have to discipline the baby for crying. That just seems so evil to me.
I agree. Yeah.
And yet I'm pausing here, and yet there are some in our own community of faith who believe that the notion of original sin and guilt has something to offer to us. And I'm not sure about that. I see
Yeah.
Simona. Did you want to comment on that? Okay, Simona has
Yes,
a comment to make.
yeah. So I actually have a couple of questions. The first of all, do you consider that sin is necessarily deliberate?
That
Well,
that's aimed at Gary, I think.
yeah. I mean, so I think that, again, if we think about these layers of meaning that I think we might associate with the word sin, I think if we're talking about choices for which people are responsible, then I think those are choices that people make, at least with some minimum level of awareness. I mean, if that minimum level of awareness isn't there, then I would say we're not talking about responsibility, and we're not therefore talking about sinful choice at all in that sense concerned with choice. Now, as regards dispositions, both dispositions of a kind of individual nature, and then a kind of deep level disposition of the sort we might talk about as original sin. I think that can absolutely be in place. Those sorts of dispositions can certainly be in place without our being aware of them, and indeed can be especially problematic precisely because we're not aware of them, right? I mean, I think one of the functions of both classic spiritual direction on the one hand and decent psychotherapy on the other is precisely to increase our awareness of dispositions like that we may otherwise seek to kind of ignore, right? We don't really want to see those sides of ourselves. So I absolutely think that dispositions might not be deliberate. I think choices, if they're responsible choices, need to be deliberate, or they're not ones for which we're responsible. So that's, I guess, the way I would tend to kind of split that.
The reason I'm asking is because Paul wrote, I can't remember exactly where, I think it was in Romans, but don't quote me on this, that he talks about if we are not aware that something is a sin, then if we are not acting out of a guilty mind and sort of, that's mens rea kind of construct. And then, he makes a distinction there. So I think it's an important part, but on the other hand, you have people who have no conscience and therefore have no feeling of guilt, have no sense that whatever they're doing is wrong. Sociopaths, psychopaths, these are pathological constructs, but still, they are people among us. I mean, in the United States, about 10 million people. That's not a small number. So, it's sometimes not that clear cut, I think, to look at it. The second thing, would you compare maybe, for example, Bushido code with the moral values or virtues that you have mentioned here? And just to add that, because probably not everybody is aware of it. So Bushido code is code that stems from Japan. It's a code of samurai, and they have specific values that or virtues. The first one is rectitude or justice. The second is courage. Third one is benevolence or mercy. Fourth is politeness. Fifth, honesty and sincerity. Sixth is honor. Seven is loyalty. Eighth is character and self-control.
Wow.
So I think there are some really interesting things here that our Western civilization, for example, justice or courage, not listed as virtues in those first seven that you have listed.
So the standard Christian, / classical list, right? Prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, faith, hope, and love. I think fortitude and courage are often taken to kind of overlap. I mean, those and might, you might get a different reading there. But obviously, while there's clear overlap, they're not identical lists. So politeness doesn't find its way into that Western list. Just for instance, and of course, what those names for character traits mean obviously has to be worked out in relation to a whole way of life for the samurai. These are, as anthropologists in the last few decades have often said, these are thick terms, right? They're terms that are embedded in and that make sense in light of kind of rich, complex descriptions of full ways of life. And so on the face of it, it seems like there's going to be a great deal of overlap, probably in an earlier era, while honor is certainly not part of that core virtue list that I noted. Probably that would have been seen as very important in many parts of Europe and Europe influenced societies, undoubtedly less so now. I mean, I'm fumbling here on this, Simona, because I don't feel like I know enough about what's really going on in the culture of feudal Japan, to be able to talk about how the overlap, how extensive the overlaps are. They seem to be significant. They're not complete, but I hesitate to say more than that, because I feel like I'm going to quickly stumble into territory where I don't know enough.
What I'm trying to say is it seems that regardless, I mean, Japan was pretty much culturally separate from the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, for
Several
most
hundred.
of its history, right? But you're still going to see some values that are identical in both societies, but there are also some, that may be more valued in certain societies than others. So there is a cultural aspect to all this, right? Not just something that's deeply human, which seems to be shared or probably shared by everybody, but there are also some cultural aspects of what we value, what is considered a virtue. So that, I think, particularly in terms of Puritanism and its effect on United States and Western civilization, it's important to take into consideration the cultural aspects of this, I think. And then my last comment was something that you were talking about, babies being born sinful or morally imperfect. I think that babies have no morality. They don't have, to have morality, you need to have self-consciousness. And they develop that later as the brain develops. You have to be aware that something is wrong in order to be able to be moral. So that awareness is requirement for the awareness is development of the brain. Thank you.
Thanks, Simona. So I know that at least Bob has a hand up, and so I won't spend too much more time here, in part because of my own limitations. I think Simona, back to your first observation about awareness and deliberateness. When I answered your question, I didn't understand, I think, everything that you were calling our attention to, and I was thinking about just as it were, conscious choice rather than reflex. But you were also, I think, calling our attention to the issue of awareness of moral norms themselves, and not just awareness that one was choosing and awareness of the circumstances. And that's obviously a much more complicated question. I don't think for a moment that all somehow moral requirements are self-evident to everyone and aren't in any way sort of culturally mediated, don't come to people through experiences of both imitation and deliberate education and critical reflection and so forth. And so given that, I would just want to agree 100% that while there are, of course, people who are completely unconcerned about any normative limits on their behavior, people of the sort you've mentioned, and people who might be concerned some of the time but aren't at others, people who are broken in various ways and so forth, that that clearly it's got to be right that when people are simply unaware of applicable moral standards, let's say, of course I don't think that's a case in which people are morally culpable. Now, things can be complicated, I suppose. Perhaps I can put myself in a position in which I am, in virtue of my having made that prior choice, less likely to become aware of some standard than I would be otherwise. That's more complicated. But anyway, I mean, I think that's, I take your point to be that we need to be aware of the impact on culpability, the impact on moral responsibility of people's knowledge, and I just agree 100% that that's very relevant. Similarly, I think, it's when whether we're thinking about the Puritans, whether we're thinking about the samurai, of course, everything we know is in one way or another mediated to us by other people. And so there are traditions of inquiry and practice that are involved. Now, I think I'm probably in this respect, sort of enough of a Humean to think that there are probably, dispositions that we have, both good and bad, that we acquire, perhaps, that we arrive, in the world possessing. But I also think that the actual ideas and habitual practices and so forth in which we engage are ones that clearly come to us through particular traditions of belief and practice. We can look critically at those, but we don't be, just as with our theological or other beliefs, we arrive in the middle. We arrive with conversations ongoing and practices in place, and we come to acquire the raw material with which we work before we're ever in a position to be critical reflectors. And we're only subsequently in a position, it seems to me, to turn back around and start trying to grow and to improve our beliefs and practices. And so, of course, then the various traditions in which we're immersed have to be taken into account there. I think as a general matter, those, are likely to be mixed bags, right? It's, whether we're talking about the samurai or the Puritans, there are things that undoubtedly are valuable that are passed on there, and things that probably are troubling. In the case of the Puritans, we can think about, various sorts of judgmental and exclusionary attitudes that are troubling. In the case of the samurai, probably there are negative consequences of a concern with honor. On the other hand, there's a kind of diligence in industry that is, as long as it doesn't become obsessive, probably a gift from the Puritans. And with the samurai, we can think about, for instance, the concern with loyalty that certainly seems important. So anyway, I'm rambling on.
Okay, Bob, I guess, is next.
Yes, I'd like to pick up a little bit on where Simona is leading us. In a church that is global, multicultural. Okay. How do you distinguish between those, I don't know if you would want to call them values or just behaviors or choices, that are purely local and relative to a particular situation, versus those that are truly transcendent across global? Now, what happens is, of course, we send missionaries, and maybe missionaries come to us. They bring their own already ingrained cultural packages with them.
Absolutely.
And if they're not aware, of course, they want to impose them on others. Okay, I'm thinking, I just got back from a mission trip in Central America, and I became quite aware again, something that I knew when I worked in West Africa among the Muslims. And when I first went to West Africa, I was really bothered when I ran into polygamy, and I said, well, there can only be really true love between the first wife and the husband. What about the second or the third wife? And of course, I run into the same things here in Utah with, they have a history of polygamy and other values that we say, well, so how does one in the modern world, where churches are global, deal with those issues that are truly fundamental and should be the same across cultures, and accept maybe things that we say, okay, those are cultural, practice that only there. If you bring in here, it's wrong. And who has the power to decide which is which,
Yeah, I mean, and I guess nothing I say is going to be very helpful. So my own view is you sort those questions out pragmatically. That is, you engage in conversations, and when it seems to a participant in the conversation that there really is a principle that isn't narrowly localized in its application or relevance, then it's up to that participant in the conversation, I think, to continue pressing that point, just as someone who thinks that indeed a principle really is more local is obligated by believing that to keep pressing that point. I think it's a back and forth. I mean, so I can tell you what I think and why I think it in a particular case, but I don't think that my role is to be the dominant decider for our community. I think you get at something really important when you ask about not just what as it were, what's universal versus what's local, but how we might get at this. And I guess my own view is we get at this by, as a general matter, allowing for as much experimentation as possible and as much dialogue as possible. That we don't want a model in which there's an attempt to impose uniform requirements from the top. Now, I'm sure we can think of exceptions there. I think there are some cases in which, let us say, for instance, a Christian community is a community that from the beginning, it seems to me, from the first century, has emphasized it's a community that's rooted in a tradition that from the first century has emphasized breaking down barriers across culture, across sex and gender and so forth. My view is that it is the case that we can say, if we a church community ought to be pretty confident in saying that ethnic exclusivity in any church kind of institution at any level is inconsistent with the gospel. But I think there are not very many cases in which I want, even when I'm confident that I know the right answer, in which I want central kind of church authorities making decisions and trying to impose them. I want people to discover things through experimentation and conversation, not because there aren't right answers, not because some kind of relativism is the right answer. And indeed, I think that tends to be a self-defeating position, but because I'm doubtful about the infallibility of central authorities who want to impose uniform solutions on everybody.
Yeah, I think you're right. It talks about the need for humility and tolerance when we're in different situations. Thank you, Gary. Yeah.
Okay, Rodney, were you going to say something?
Yes, I'd like to turn the discussion back to that question of what is original sin that we didn't finish.
Yeah.
And yes, and I'd like to know what the conventional definition would be in both the Catholic Church and Protestant Church, and could it be articulated in a way that a teenager would understand? Because if we can't articulate it in a way that the young people would understand, we ought to be very, very careful in telling them what is sin and what is not sin.
So I take original sin, and I'm very happy for Dave to dive in here and disagree with me in one way or another, but I take original sin, really in the Western Christian tradition, both Catholic and Protestant, to be kind of twofold. Number one, original sin is what we arrive with in the world, and in virtue of which we are predisposed to behave badly. And number two, original sin is what we arrive with in the world in virtue of which we're guilty. That I think is the twofold heart of that idea. So the idea is that both guilt and a disposition to behave badly precede our conscious free maturation. That's what I take it is being said when people affirm the idea of original sin. I mean, Dave, does that seem right to you? Or do you
I think that's right, but I just want to underline it. I think it's one thing to say that a baby is born with limitations or difficulties. No human baby is born in perfect health. Okay. If original sin means only that, I'm sure that we can agree with it. But if the baby, in addition to that, is guilty for not, and worthy of eternal hell, okay?
That's a horrible idea. Yeah.
It's not merely that the child is born with limitations because, say, genetic or whatever, environmental. It's not merely, every child is born, let's say, imperfect in some way.
Excuse me.
But to hold that child guilty and worthy of condemnation, as is the case in many Roman Catholic settings, I think it is. The child has to be baptized, otherwise the child's going to go to hell.
Excuse me, David.
Yeah, 1 second. I think the Greek
You
tradition is
finish. I
different
have to
on
say
this.
something about it.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's true for the Catholic Church. It has never been true for the Orthodox Church. And that's because of the Irenaeus, one of the fathers. His explanation on that was that no, he did not believe in that original sin, but rather that Adam and Eve were immature. They were not mature in learning and in practicing. And therefore, in the Orthodox Church, it has been relatively recent that they do baptize the children as babies. And the reason for that, the explanation for that is not because of the original sin, but because they don't believe that. We don't believe that in the Orthodox Church about that, but rather that to start early the child in the education of Christianity and among the family, but not because of the original sin. And that's why also in the Orthodox Church, there is not last rites. They believe we can die without
Last rites.
of grace is right. It's very different. We don't have last rites. We also don't have purgatory. So sometimes, it's confused the Catholic with the Orthodox position. And then later on, I started a little late today, so I didn't have my hand up. But if it's time at the very end, I would like to make some comments and then a couple of questions to Gary about what you mentioned about which is true in the sense of theory and practice about virtues, and that both in Plato and Socrates, of course, the sophists were the ones with their rhetoric that they would rather speak, but they did not, as we say, walk the talk. And and Socrates, and what I loved about Gary, I'm taking too time, what I loved in his book is that he has that together, what is love and flourishing for ourselves and others, and practice, which is very much like Papa Nicolau, but I'm going lots of things. And so in Socrates, and also in Simonas, justice, as Gary also said, was actually in the Republic, the highest form of goodness was justice, and all the other forms were underneath. So because Western civilization, and again, as Gary said, I was reading his last chapter, because some things changed or they did not study or so, we don't blame it on those that it was there, but it has not been practiced. But justice, absolutely, as Gary said, was part of our of the pillars of our Western civilization. But anyway, I didn't why it's some other things later I want to, in fact, may quickly say how inspiring, how learning and inspiring Gary's book is. And I see what I was going to ask him is, I see very much what, again, Socrates, and he has gone more into explanation and practical as well as theoretical, that, for instance, the love Okay, I should stop. About his love, God's love, God's laws are also love, because God created ecstatic love, so his laws, and those are the best for us. And therefore, the selfish thing to do, according to Socrates, like in Christianity, is to best love our neighbor. And like Gary had said before, it's better that we suffer injustice than cause injustice. So I love his book. Thank you. Sorry, I won't talk again today.
Where's Forrest?
David, David, I'd like you to finish your thought. You never finished your thought on original sin. You went to a baby definition, and if it relates to self-awareness, then does a person begin to sin at 10, 12, 15, whatever? But you still haven't given me your definition of what is original sin. I can't deduce it from what you've said.
Well, original sin has, I'm just going to quote Gary, original sin has two aspects to it, one of which makes sense and the other of which doesn't make sense. The way in which it makes sense is that every child is born somewhat limited by his or her genetic inheritance and other things, and then by the environment in which the youngster lives. So the question, none of us debates that, of course. The question is whether those imperfections or those limitations are worthy of condemning the child for being guilty. So if original sin means inheriting unfortunate tendencies, of course. If original sin means holding that person guilty for that, no. And so that's I think it's a very, very important issue, and I don't mind that we're pausing here because there are colleagues of ours who believe that Adventists are weak on original sin, and that they need to bring more of that in. And we have to be very careful there. We don't want to look at a baby and say, by virtue of being born a human being, that baby is condemned. Now, when does a person sin? What is it? Sin, I would take it, and Gary's going to jump in here and see what he say. A sin is when one deliberately does something one knows to be wrong.
Sure, I'm fine with that account. Sure.
Okay, now that means. Now let me try a real quick illustration. You have got a really good doctor, gives a patient something, a patient dies right on the spot. Some kind of allergic reaction nobody anticipated. Well, the doctor did the wrong thing, medically speaking, but it was not a sin, and it was not malpractice because the doctor acted in good faith with full knowledge of the appropriate medical resources. Now, if the doctor was careless, then we would say the doctor was a bad doctor. But a good person can make mistakes, and that doesn't mean they're bad people. I don't know, Gary, what do you want to say?
Yeah, no, I think you're making a very important distinction between, in other words, obviously people can use the word sin in a variety of ways, but I certainly, like you, would want to limit the word sin when we're talking about sins in the plural, sins as bad choices, to those choices that are both objectively wrong and subjectively wrong. Subjectively, as in the actor knows, or at any rate is reckless or negligent with respect to knowledge, of the wrongness of the action. So that somebody who acts in good faith, I just don't think we want to say that person is in so doing we don't say that person is sinning. Yeah, I think we're completely agreed there, Dave.
And neither one of you have mentioned Adam and Eve and the fruit. And I've never heard a discussion about original sin without that coming up. So do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, I'll just say again, I think the idea of original sin can be, as I said here in the chat, right? I think the Western tradition assumes that the first human sin changes human nature and creates a predisposition for the first human sinners themselves and their descendants. Now, I think a lot of people who talk about original sin aren't committed to any particular view of human origins, but I think you're absolutely right that is that's clearly a traditional piece of the original sin story, but it matters finally, I think, for Western Christianity because it's a comment on how people in fact behave and are predisposed to behave, and the fact that people are in fact guilty and predisposed to be guilty. And clearly there are Christians, Western and Eastern alike, who want to talk about predispositions to bad behavior or even liability to guilt in ways that are independent of any particular view of human origins.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, David. Can you hear me, David? Hello?
David Vagelin?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, good, good.
Forrest.
David, for a point of order, could we take our break now? Because it's right at 11:30.
Could I just say something?
Hang on a minute, Simona. And then we'll come back and let Gary finish up his lecturing, or how do you want to handle it?
Well, we've done it differently today. That is, we didn't give Gary a chance to go through the whole thing, but we jumped in right away because we had questions, and I don't regret that because these are very, very important questions, and they are very practical. How Bob Ford just put up, is there such a thing as a sinful personality? Well, if by sinful personality one means a personality that is marred in some way, maybe is clinically depressed, but the person is not guilty and worthy of condemnation. That's the point. Is the person worthy of condemnation? And unfortunately, many people in the Western tradition have said yes. Wesley said, and this goes back to Anastasia, Wesley said we should get in touch with the Greek tradition on this.
Yes.
So Wesley said, go back to the Greeks because the Orthodox were clearer on this. And we are part of the Wesleyan tradition. So it's true, we are weak on some aspects of original sin, and I say thank God for that. But okay, Forrest, I think we'll have to.
Well, let's let Simona make her brief statement. Then we'll go to our break. Simona.
Yeah.
I think that in my upbringing, at least, the idea of original sin has always been the same, and that's the separation from God. So it has nothing to do with action. It has nothing to do with morality. It's the state of humanity that we are separated from God. However, at the same time, that this problem has been solved by the sacrifice of Jesus. And because God lives outside of the time, that sacrifice covers both before, after, and those who live at the same time. And therefore, the separation of God, the original sin, has already been annihilated through Jesus. And so the whole question of original sin becomes mute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, David, let's take our break now.
Okay.
For 10 minutes, which would bring us back at 11:42. And
okay,
we'll let Gary finish up, if that would be okay with you, Gary.
Keep talking.
Yeah.
And, okay, all right, whatever we want to do.
We haven't yet got to the notion of infused virtues, which is one of the places where Catholics and Protestants have
Okay.
typically
Okay.
differed. So we need to get into that too. I doubt that we'll get into actual virtues. Well, what we were talking about, the preliminaries before we can talk about that. Okay, break time.
Break time. Okay,
Okay.
there we go.
Okay, let's go back to Gary, and maybe we can ask him to talk about whether virtues are infused, which is a Roman Catholic way of thinking, but not all Protestants have agreed with that. I don't know if Gary is back.
Yeah, Gary's here. There he goes. Come on. Okay, Gary, to you. Infuse.
Yeah.
We're going to infuse this to you now.
Yeah. So more than happy to just keep on with the conversation that the exchange Dave and I have been having has prompted, but just to say something briefly about the idea of infused virtue. I think this is an idea that like all interesting and complex ideas, shouldn't simply be dismissed, but I think it's an idea we ought to talk about carefully. So the idea of infused virtue, I understand to be the idea that virtues or some subset of virtues can be, in effect, imparted miraculously. And so that a person can be said to have as a virtue a trait or disposition which doesn't kind of develop in the way that ordinarily traits and dispositions and habits develop, but instead comes into being as the result of some kind of miraculous divine intervention. This seems to me to be an unhelpful idea that kind of bypasses the reality of and the integrity, let's say, of creatures and their freedom. That doesn't mean for a moment that there aren't sources of virtue, sources of inspiration for virtue that come from outside us. And it doesn't mean that we can't see those as embodying or conveying divine grace, right? So, I mean, when I am affected by the inspiring example of someone, when I am affected by my environment in one way or another, these are factors that impact my development, we may suppose, of virtues, of character traits, of dispositions in one way or another. And so they are ways in which grace may be in play, because these are not, as it were, achievements of mine. Instead, they come as gifts from outside me. But that's quite different from saying that the virtues that people develop could include habits or traits or dispositions that were, as it were, kind of directly created miraculously in ways that bypass the back and forth of human growth and free choice and so forth. So I don't think we want to deny the value of factors external to the agent as media of grace to the agent, but I think we should be doubtful about an account of virtue that sees it as potentially created whole cloth by miracle.
Okay. Do we want to talk more about these preliminaries, or should we get right into the virtues themselves?
But let's do that. But before we do, Dave, I'm just curious to know what you think about infused virtue. You wanted us to talk about it. I'm curious to know what your thoughts might be.
Well, I think I understand. No, let me put it this way. I think, well, no, let me try again. I believe what I understand you to be saying. That's
Okay. So maybe that implies I wasn't clear, and I'm sorry about that.
No, that doesn't imply that at all. It just means I am being cautious about my own hearing. I think that that terrible word cooperation isn't so terrible. That is, we do cooperate with God in the development of our characters.
Sure.
And I think that there are many people who deny that and who feel like the Adventist heritage is mistaken for saying that. But I disagree. I think participating in the divine nature suggests that by our choices, we can become more or less God-like. Now, that's very, very dangerous to say, but it's also dangerous to say that nothing we do can change the people we are. I think that that's even as dangerous. So yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Do you want to talk about, let's see if anybody wants to talk about any of these preliminaries about virtues and vices, which are good habits or bad habits, before we talk about the particular virtues and vices we have.
Peter got his in, and I've still got you, Anastasia, but hold on. Peter, we're going to come to you.
The fact that different cultures, they have this moral code, some values, we call them. It tells me that it's something that Isaiah, I think, was calling the moral voice that you hear when you have to act or to do something. You will hear behind your ear that voice that is telling you what is right, and you have to walk in it. Apostle Paul is talking also about the people that do not have a law, but they are still doing the facts of the law. That tells me that there is a moral voice that it's still working, still telling us what is good and what is bad. I recognize also that for some people, because of maybe their moral degradation, this voice, it's softer than in others. In others, it's speaking more loudly than in others. This one reflection in regard to that. In regard to virtue, we know that in Greek, part of the Greek philosophy, we have the Stoic current that was paying great importance to virtue. They were interested in living a virtuous moral life. And what they understood through virtue was wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. That were the four things that they were focusing on. Now, think about inherent disposition, Gary, that you're mentioning. I believe this is closely related to the original sin. And you posted something, if I understood it correctly, that in the West, they didn't believe in moral original sin. Well,
I'm sorry, Peter, just the opposite. Peter, let me interrupt just for a second. I said just the opposite. I think it's the Eastern Orthodox people that don't make as much about sin as the Latin people do.
Correct. Correct. But we have this current, the Stoic current, that praise very much the virtue. And talking about the original sin, I think, Gary, you put in chat a post that in the West, they didn't believe in the original sin, or I misunderstood you.
I think Dave and I are saying the same thing, Peter, that I think the Western view I have taken to be twofold, that the first human sin leads to it's being the case that all subsequent humans, as well as the first sinners themselves, deal with two liabilities. First of all, with a disposition to behave wrongly, and second, with inherited guilt. Those and that twofold liability, I take it, is what is characteristically meant when we talk about original sin. That I take it to be a widespread Western view, kind of broadly Augustinian view, which we find among many Catholics and many Protestants.
Because we have different, very strong views about the original sin. I mean, starting with Paul, the Apostle Paul is talking about he believed in original sin. And then Augustine also believed in that. And then we look at Martin Luther, that strongly, very strongly believed in the original sin. And he believed that basically without God's help, we cannot solve this problem, that it's creating serious problem for us. And we recall that Luther had a strong disagreement with Erasmus of Rotterdam, and the split between two of these great of the Reformation people, they got into, because Erasmus believed that we can perfect somehow or correct our human nature through education. And also we know that humanists believe that through education we can correct, we can improve and perfect our nature. Now, my question to you is, because we have different views. I mean, we can mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his social contract. He believed that all people are born free, but they are in chain. What he was talking about is that what is around us, it's influencing in good or bad. John Locke is talking about tabula rasa, that the children are born with, I mean, their brain, it's clear, is nothing on it, that inclination are good or evil. It's a different view. And I said we have different views in Western civilization. But my question to you is, what do you think about this, the role of this moral voice? Is a real thing or it is not?
Well, you know, I guess on my view, there are broadly speaking three sources of moral judgment that we experience. And I don't think we need to see these as in conflict. And I think we can see divine providence as, in principle, in work in all of them. Those three are kind of inherited dispositions, social influences, and moral reasoning. And all three of those, it seems to me, can be in play in one way or another in our making of moral judgments. I think as a result of that, because these different things are in play, people clearly have you know, or can have something like the experience that you described. But I would just say that that there's no automatic guarantee that what they're getting is a kind of perfect insight into what's morally appropriate, because people do have inner moral kind of dispositions, but it doesn't follow that those aren't in one way or another affected by poor reasoning, by genetic complications of one sort or another, by social influences that are negative. Social influences, genetics, reasoning can all be sources of good moral judgment, but can also be sources of bad moral judgment. So, yeah, I think there certainly can be something like an inner moral voice. I just don't think that we should regard it as in any way infallible.
This be caused by the state of moral degradation of the society, because
Not
Paul is talking in
not
Romans.
necessarily. That's what I'm saying. It can just be, not moral degradation of the society. It can just be poor reasoning that somebody might engage in, or a moral tradition that someone's inherited in the society might be mistaken. That need not be a matter of degradation. It can just be a matter of mistake.
What about Paul in Romans 1, that people lost their way and believe all kinds of strange things?
Yeah, people have many foolish and sometimes deeply destructive beliefs. Absolutely.
But why? The question is why they lost their way.
Oh, I think why? Again, I think you can imagine a combination of factors in play there. But I don't think that people are not infallible judges of moral truth. Nobody is. And people are not fallible, people are fallible rather. They may be fallible because there are, as you're suggesting, kind of moral problems for them or for their societies, but also I think there are just epistemic limitations of one kind or another that people have that complicate things and may create opportunities for them to choose badly. Choices in reasoning, inadequate traditions that are passed on to them in one way or another. The dispositions that they inherit may in one way or another be deficient. That may sometimes be a function of moral brokenness and a desire to reinforce the morally problematic, but I don't think it has to be that. I think we can imagine a variety of other reasons why the environment and dispositions and so forth that people have may render them less than good judges of what's morally right.
Okay. All right, David, should we let Gary continue now, or should I go? I got Anastasia, she wants to ask a question.
Well, let's hear from Anastasia. Yeah.
Okay, short question.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'll have a small statement and a question. The definition, while we're on the subject, the definition, first of all, again, I have your book here, and I see a tremendous humility besides knowledge and a hope for the future to understand and to learn more. And love is the center of it. In the ancient Greek word amartia, as you know, was a sterile a, and amartia, missing the mark. And I got especially moved by your statement about God's ecstatic love for creating nature, the cosmos and its creatures. And therefore, he also created the laws for that cosmos and the creatures, that is love. Which brings me to my question. Isn't therefore, because I believe certain things are eternal,
yes,
and in limited ways, and you do too, in limited ways, those truths have come down, and we hopefully, we believe with the Holy Spirit, we understand more, but isn't that very much in sync? And from reading your book, that what Socrates said about missing the mark and knowledge, first of all, that we have to learn how to love, and knowledge is important, but also, which also clarified, I could never I mean, I always search why Christ said, forgive them, Father, because they do not know. That, as you pointed in many ways, what do we learn, what do we know? But isn't that what you said about the laws and the love of the love for the laws for his creature, that are that the laws for the creation and the creatures are also the ecstatic love of God, and therefore is the best for us, which isn't it in sync with Socrates believed that we really love ourselves truly when, and we flourish actually the best, the F, when we love the others. And the way you explained how we loved the others, our love and flourishing cannot be excluded by doing also in our loving for others. Isn't that true? I suppose this, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And if I fail to talk about what you want me to talk about, of course, it's fine to push back. Yeah, I think learning is inescapably important when it comes to both acquiring moral knowledge and also just to developing as persons who make good moral judgments and good moral choices. And I don't, I mean, it's an honor to think that I might be saying something that aligns with the insights of Socrates, right? I think I'm always struck by the remarkable claim in John 1 that the Logos is the light that enlightens everyone, and that doesn't mean that everyone responds equally well to enlightenment, but it does mean that we shouldn't be surprised to find wisdom in a variety of places. And certainly we should be delighted to find it in the Greco-Roman tradition that a number of people today have called attention to. So, yeah, I think we need to learn. That's and the fact that ongoing moral learning is something that the importance of which is highlighted in the moral tradition that's passed on to us from Socrates. I'm delighted to affirm that. And again, I absolutely, as you say, I want to stress at more than one point in the book that love understood as appropriate regard is appropriate regard for the agent as well as appropriate regard for the other. And that in the Greco-Roman tradition, in the virtue tradition of the West, really up until fairly recently in the West, I think it's been generally understood that we don't want to see those as at odds with each other or as radically distinct from each other, but rather as very much in tandem with each other. So, yeah, those two things that I heard you emphasize, three things: the importance of recognizing the similarity between what we're saying here and the earlier tradition, notably Socrates, number one; number two, the value of learning; and number three, the link between love of self and love of other. All of that seems completely right to me, and I say three cheers. So, if there's more you want us to reflect on together, please highlight that. But I think I'm with you on those issues.
That's very wonderful and clear. And I love also, as we mentioned, that Irenaeus, one of the fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church, does not believe in the original sin the way the Catholic Church. And I think you explained that also very well. And thank you so very much. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, I've got Rodney has his hand up.
Gary, I really appreciate the discussion today about sin without introducing the confounding variable of Satan, the father of sin, who in our childhood was, we were informed, was going around like prowling, whatever, trying to tempt good children and good people to do bad things. And so having a discussion about sin without introducing what we learned as to be the father of sin was very useful. So thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely, Rodney. I don't intend anything I say to foreclose any conversations about non-human personal evil, but I think the way I take the most insightful figures in the Christian tradition to have thought about this, the sin of any non-human persons is itself, a puzzle in the same way that human sin is, and doesn't kind of get us out of any intellectual, fixes. So I think it's, we don't, the deep questions remain one way or the other there. And I think you're absolutely right that there can be some very problematic consequences associated with particular ways of talking about that. Again, I'm not in any way saying, let's just assume that, humans are the only creatures out there, and that there aren't creatures much more powerful than we are. I do want to say, as I've observed before in this context, that while well, I think there's always something to learn from Jack Provencha. I think I'm not persuaded that Jack's right ever in talking about, and saying there's a devil who is, quote, a universe class contender, who's a figure who's almost on the level of God. God is always infinitely more than any creature, no matter how powerful that creature. And I think talk about the devil in the Christian tradition that has tended more toward a kind of Manichaean dualism, I think, is a real mistake. So.
Okay, continue on, Gary. Oh, wait a minute, I got McKinley, got his hand. Hi, McKinley.
I'd like to raise my hand too.
Oh, okay. Let me take McKinley first, David. Or
Oh,
did you
sure.
want
I'm no rush.
Okay, all right. Okay, McKinley.
Thank you, Forrest. I've been debating whether to ask my question here, but I suppose the idea of original sin is meant to understand the human predisposition to evil. I have some observations here, but let me put this question first. How might the diagnosis that I'm going to mention here from the scripture inform the discussion about original sin? Genesis 6:9, the 6:6-9, the imagination of the human heart was evil continually. Jeremiah 17:9, the human heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? 1 Corinthians 2:14, the human nature is naturally hostile to God. And then, of course, all have sinned and falling short of God's glory. So when one takes all of these into account, the human disposition is naturally to do evil. That's human nature. So the question then to you, Gary, is how might these diagnoses inform thinking about original sin? And based on your, I guess, reflections on this topic.
So I think it is apparent that there are human dispositions to behave wrongly, which we observe across the board. The late Dick Koobs used to like to talk about some folks as genetic saints. And perhaps Dick was right in identifying some people that way. But if so, the point still is that even those people we see who really do exhibit a great deal of virtue instinctively don't I think strike any of us as morally perfect and arrive in the world with dispositions to choose wrongly. So as we suggested, Dave and I suggested before, I think we agree about this. The idea of original sin seems to feature characteristically two components. One of those components is a predisposition to choose wrongly. And the other is a state of guilt. So the idea of original sin as including both of those, I think, is problematic, first and foremost, because the idea of a kind of arrival of human persons on the scene already guilty is problematic in a host of ways. The disposition that we bring to the table to choose wrongly in varying proportions, but some such disposition, I think, as evident throughout our the lives of ourselves and all the people we know, that's the way in which, as I believe it was Herbert Butterfield who famously said, the idea of original sin is the one Christian doctrine subject to empirical verification. The Methodist historian Butterfield. So, I mean, I think that's right. There's clear evidence for that in human experience, but that's different from the idea of original sin as ordinarily understood, because that's an idea that also includes this notion of inherited guilt, and that's a notion that I think is unsustainable.
So very quickly, if I may, first forgive me. So I think this discussion is attempting to, I guess, tease out this idea of guilt by birth. And I'm wondering whether it's possible, and I'm not advocating this in any way, but I'm wondering if it's possible to acknowledge the overall recognition of guilty humanity, but not eliminating the possibility of the solution that addresses that guilt. Meaning we can acknowledge that humans are predisposed to evil and the declaration in Romans 3, but at the same time also accept that in that declaration there is a remedy. Do you see a conflict between the two, recognizing or acknowledging that humans can be found or proclaimed guilty of sin by nature, but at the same time that guilt gives way to the remedy?
So I don't think there's an inherent conflict between those two ideas. I just don't think that the idea of guilt by nature is a coherent or defensible notion.
Okay, I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, David, your question.
Yes, I'd like to make two comments, one a more theoretical one. And I think we can, and this is specifically in response to Peter, I think we can distinguish three positions on this matter. Let's take Rousseau and Locke. They say the child is born morally neutral and without any guilt. Augustine, Luther, Calvin, and that whole tradition say the child is born with bad tendencies and is guilty. So Locke and Rousseau and the Augustinian tradition strike me as opposite. What I understand myself to be saying, and what I understand Gary to be saying, is that yes, we are born with these dispositions, but we are not condemned for having them. Having said that, let me be very personal, very, very personal. I am half Irish. That means my disposition to alcoholism is very high. Only about 2% of Jewish people become alcoholics. The number of Irish people who become alcoholics is extraordinarily high. I don't drink alcohol because I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't drink alcohol because I'm Irish. And that's a very, very, very real thing. Now, God does not condemn me for having been born an Irish person with that predisposition. But God does condemn me if I willfully, intentionally use alcohol in a way that I shouldn't. Now, I use those words willfully and intentionally. I think people can be overwhelmed. Their willpower can be overwhelmed by some addiction or whatever. But for me to think that God condemns me for being more prone to alcoholism than he condemns Jewish people because they're not prone to alcoholism, I think is portraying a view of God that is not only false, but reprehensible. And I'm being very, very clear about this because there are those in our community of faith who want to bring in the idea that we are guilty by virtue of being born flawed. And that is just not what I think. I think Augustine was wrong on that. Calvin was wrong on that. Luther was wrong on that. That whole tradition is wrong on that, in my view.
Well, I believe that the decisions, our acts are important. Eyes of God. I agree with you.
Well, should we, somebody else, looks like Forrest wants to speak.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to step away just for a second. I might be throwing a monkey wrench into the works here, Gary, and
Yeah.
but, things we look at here are pre-scientific. Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, Locke and Hume. Where does modern psychology and modern neurological findings relate to these issues of virtues? Do they relate? Just your comment on that. And I would also conclude my comment by saying, for instance, Sam Harris does not believe in free will in the sense that we are influenced by everything around us, by our environment, our genes, or whatever. So just how does all this relate in light of these things?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously what we want to say about free will is a quarter's worth of conversations. And so anything that I say is almost unavoidably going to be glib. Perhaps most of what I say here is glib anyway. I think that our own, on the one hand, our own experience of choice is, at least some of the time, very much the experience of choosing among life possibilities. And on the other hand, I think our conviction that God is good is tenable, as far as I can see, only if God is not responsible for many things that go on in the world in some deep sense, that God's intentions are inconsistent with many of the things that go on in the created world. So it might turn out to be the case that our experience is deeply flawed and that the conclusions we draw from that experience are mistaken. And it might, of course, be the case that the world is just the kind of world that's incompatible with belief in God. So that, I mean, that's certainly, we have to allow for both of those possibilities. But I would just nudge us, at least not to abandon either of those views immediately, to recognize that both our social environment and our biological inheritance predispose us to action in various ways is, I think, at this stage, just commonsensical. That's different, as far as I can see, from supposing that we know or have good reason to believe that either our social environment or our biological inheritance are unequivocally dispositive with regard to our actions, that there aren't, that we're not in one way or another in a position to make choices in light of those. That, at any rate, is the wager that I continue to make. I think the judging that that's the case, again, I think is reasonable in light of both the picture of the world that I think is required if we're going to believe in the goodness of God, and certainly also just our own experiences as those who make choices. One thing I'd emphasize, by the way, is that part of that inheritance, both social and biological, is positive as well as negative. So I think we are disposed in one way or another to choose wrongly by our inheritance. On the other hand, I think it's also clear that from very early on, before we're ever in a position to be, conscious agents, we also find ourselves with dispositions to things like kindness and generosity and loyalty, as well as to bad behaviors, to unreasonable self-assertion, to cruelty, to punitive attitudes, and so forth. So I think we have to begin with a recognition of social and biological influence. We don't have to see that influence, I think, as so overweening that our capacity for choice is eliminated, and we ought to recognize that influence can be both positive and negative.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And by the way, I would like to say my mother was a Sullivan. So David, I'm half Irish too. So
we better stay away from that stuff.
I'd just like to recommend the book, How the Irish Saved the Western World. So
all right.
Yeah, it's a whole series of those books by an author who's died now, but who also wrote The Gifts of the Jews, and Thomas Keneally, not Thomas Keneally, but
I can't remember. I just like the one about the Irish. I'm very selective on this. So anyway, but thank you.
Thomas Cahill. I've got it.
That's right, Thomas Cahill.
Yeah.
You're right. Good enough. So anyway, thank you for that. And I'm seeing now. I'm looking at some hands. I see. Let me try to get some people. Okay. Okay, Dr. Alexander, we're going to go to you. Stephen, go ahead, because you haven't had a chance yet. Just unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I would absolutely concur with Gary's proposition that we are a product of both nature and nurture, and that we have in the context of that, in my view, both as a clinician as well as from a theological perspective, that does not any of those predispositions from a nature perspective, those inherited predispositions, and along with the nurture that we encounter and as we develop, those are not immutable necessarily. They are things that we continue to make can make choices of around, and learning to navigate and to manage, so that we draw closer to what our Creator intended us to be as in the original. And that's my theological perspective. I know as a clinician that when people are begin to understand what it is that they are confronted with, that is what it is that both either nature and nurture have delivered to them and that they've experienced and that they have to manage, that they then begin to recognize, or can begin to recognize, the choices that are available to them to navigate those situations in a more productive and healthy way. And so that's I think that, but that's part of the human condition, and that's the challenge. And so that's where, from my perspective, the issue of choice and free will does play a part, because we're not condemned to exist in those paradigms, without any recourse. And therefore, we have the ability to choose. And where learning comes in is learning what those choices are and learning what the options are in terms of making ourselves, from a theosis perspective, drawing closer to what God intended, and therefore that we are created in His image, and we can draw closer to what that image actually is.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's great to hear from you in your, kind of wearing your clinician hat and talking about the tightrope here, right? That people do arrive with constraints on their agency and nonetheless do seem genuinely to be able to choose.
Okay. All right. We're almost out of time, but I've got two hands up, and I want to go to Simona first, and then Peter, you'll be our last question today. So Simona.
Thank you. I want to state that I don't think that anybody makes a bad decision on purpose, apart from, maybe malevolent intent, and these are specific conditions. But, we make the best decisions we are capable of based on the information that we have. And I think the issue of information is important here. People do not sometimes understand the consequences. They don't have sufficient information to make the right choice. That lack of information can come from various sources. It could be upbringing. They're primed to react in a certain way without realizing what the consequences may be. And then secondly, we inherit the capacity. What we do with it is a combination of things. And it relies on opportunities, on choices, on learned behaviors, and environmental factors, all these other things. So you can be born with the capacity to become a genius, but if you never put any effort into learning and getting to some point that actually you can do something with it, you will never become one. You can have the capacity to become the world-renowned pianist, but if you never learn to play, this will never happen. And so there are all kinds of factors that contribute to what we are and what we are not. And second, I think that I think it was Elmer who wrote in the chat something about quantum physics. I want to just make a comment on that a little bit. It's like when you observed it, you have defined it. So the moment you observe something, you have fixed that moment. And sometimes we make this mistake with people. We observe people at a time when they're maybe stressed out, when they're making the bad decision, when they are not at their best, and we make a decision. We define them. We constrain them within this bad decision that they have made, and we don't give them a choice of change. And I think this is wrong. And we need to be very careful how we judge people. I think as a society, we're extremely judgmental. We judge people even based on things they could not change or could not choose. for example, their sexual identity. And so I think we have to be very careful in our propensity for judgment to understand that there is a possibility for change, and that change always starts with love.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
I want to just cheer for Simona's observation that we are in a very judgmental society, that we make a profound error when we take a snapshot of someone and turn that into a kind of universal depiction of where that person is, and that whenever we do seek to evoke change, we can't do so without love. So, yeah.
Okay, Peter.
Quick question for Gary. We have an opposite view of the original thing coming from the humanists, that they didn't believe in original sin, but they believe that people are born with no sin, no problems, and their nature could be improved, reach even perfection through education. What do you believe about that?
Well, so I think that education is one of the means of grace, and that one of the ways in which divine grace plays out in people's lives is precisely through education. So I certainly favor education, and I think it matters. What I think we ought to be very concerned about, however, and very hesitant about, is the sort of view that we find in certain kinds of utopian movements that assume that human beings are sufficiently plastic that the right kind of educational programming can simply reshape them entirely in light of some utopian vision. I think we ought to be deeply troubled and skeptical about that. So I don't want to blame the Greeks for that, either the classical Greeks or the Greek Christian tradition. But I think anybody who does think that, who thinks that this kind of infinite plasticity is a feature of human nature, is making a profound mistake. Education is valuable. That doesn't mean that it is omnipotent.
We have a recent example with the German people. It was the most educated, giving great minds, and they were behaving the way they did. How can we explain that?
The awful behavior of so many people in Germany in the middle part of the 20th century isn't something I'm going to be able to sort out without having thought much more carefully about that than I am going to be able to do right now. I think clearly we know that there is a general human tendency to be profoundly suspicious of those who are perceived as this is a bit complicated, but I'll just note this as one of many factors, right? The profoundly brutal mistreatment, not only of Jewish people in Central Europe, but of Armenians in the Turkish Empire, of people, say, from South Asia, in Africa, of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. There is one factor that's common to all of these cases of mistreatment is a failure to understand the social role of what we somewhat clumsily call middlemen, and the way in which a society depends on those who play intermediary roles is often obscured, and people are targets of hostility when in fact they're playing profoundly valuable roles, as I think certainly Jewish people did in the German economy. Clearly, we know that there's a history of Christian anti anti-Semitism that complicates that story. We know that, but I feel like anything I say is really going to very quickly descend into, again, into some sort of glibness. I think we're, yeah, I want to not try to resolve this awful question with some glib throwaway remark in the next 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. And David, I'm coming back to you and for our
Okay,
closing.
thank you, Gary. We didn't get to the list of virtues, but I think the discussion of what sin is and what sin isn't is very important and valuable. And what you heard from me, and I think from Gary, is one point of view on this, and there is the opposite point of view that is more in favor of what Augustine taught. Whether Paul taught it, I think, is worthy of discussion, but there's no doubt that Augustine and Calvin and Luther and all those people taught it, and I think I'm just in a different theological tradition. Now, as we know, today is the end of the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School 1.0. Next Sabbath, the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School continues 2.0. So it will continue, but it will be a little different. And I ask two things of you. One is that you notice that from now on, you're likely to get only one email message a week. And in that email message will be the password. So you will get the password in the middle of the week and not on Sabbath morning. If for any reason, somehow that doesn't work, we will also have the password on the website. So you can go there as a fallback. And the website is called Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School.com. Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School.com. And we will put up the website, the sign-in information there. That's the first thing. The second request I have is that those of you who find it possible, stay by for the digital potluck, not only for the good time you'll have, but that will be a regular time to do some organizational work. Just take a few minutes to see who's going to do what in the upcoming Sabbaths. And that's a lot easier if that becomes a kind of congregation time and place than if we have to chase each other down all over wherever we may be. So Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School 2.0 begins next week. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Big thanks for so much, David.
Thank you, Rodney.